Okay, hello. This is an introduction into a series of lessons I'll be teaching on American wars. More specifically, how the United States either starts a war or manipulates the U.S. public into joining an ongoing war. All right, I'll go through a number of examples, um, uh, but not today. Not in this introduction. In this introduction, I want to give you some background information, and first, I want to give you an idea of how warfare has evolved. And honestly, I don't believe the average person will fully appreciate this until they go through my series of lessons in which they see real examples. All right, then they can better understand what's going on, what I'm saying here. And also, I want to bust several commonly held myths about U.S. wars. So we'll start with the evolution. We're going to go through classic empire building, then through mercantilism, then through colonialism, including wars of colonial independence, which naturally followed after these, and then modern industrial wars. Okay. All right. So, in all cases, you see that there's a circular relationship here between uh, making weapons and building military forces, both land and sea, armies equipped, right? Navies with ships and so forth, right? And then the means of conquering and controlling resources from which you tap profits. And with these profits, the wealth created, you use that to build your military assets here, okay? So they go hand in hand. All right, so classic empire building, you can think of the big empires, I don't know, Roman Empire, Greece, uh, Persian, whatever, okay, Babylon, all right? Uh, okay, so you make weapons, build military forces, and both on land and sea, and then you conquer territory. That's kind of a key thing here. And you conquer territory to control resources. These resources are typically land, uh, and from that land, you're not controlling like tomatoes or carrots, or you're controlling money, taxes, right? You converted that to something that's non-perishable and that's portable in the form of money, and it can, money or tribute, anything non-perishable. It can include spices or perfumes or precious metals, um, any form of booty, right? So these are material resources you want to control, but it's equally important, if not more important, to control human resources. And now to control human resources, you have to create incentives, benefits, right? Within the system. If you want to impose and control an empire, right, you have to get people who are going to commit to it, or at least subject themselves to it. And for this, you have to look at their self-interest, right? The key commodity here is a self. The fundamental aspect of human nature is self-serving, and you got to control this. So other things you want to do is integrate cultures. It's often been done in great empires. You want to establish law and order in order to not to control things for yourself, but to create conditions of prosperity, that there's safety, that people can be, productive and without fear of, criminality. And oftentimes they would establish a military presence, but military presence can backfire in inspiring insurgencies. You want to build transportation infrastructures. Of course, you want to secure borders. You want to suppress uprisings within the people, and you want to suppress infighting between them. And that goes to part of the law and order prosperity. All right. I guess a key example I could give here is the Roman Empire, Pax Romana, which was very effective for the most part for a good 400 or 500 years, and a large part of that was, Pax Romana means peace of Rome, right? The fact that, within the system, maybe you don't like it, but at least it kept the law and order, kept peace, allowed you to be productive and live your lives without fear of threat, you know. So people subjected themselves to it. All right, you want to secure the trading routes, which is huge, to control wealth flow. And the key idea here is you want to promote and tap the production capacity of a region, right? You know, the old idea that you go in with an army, you plunder, you rape and pillage and destroy. Oh no, this is not effective. This is not long term, right? It's a short term game, but you kill the golden goose, right? You kill your cash cow, right? So plunder destroys production capacity. I mean, you could think of like the 30 Years' War or something like that, or modern day, the new wars, where it destroys production capacity, right? Just creates, conditions of desperate poverty. Um, all right. So yeah, from this you tap wealth, and with wealth, then you go back and build your military resources. All right, that's classic empire building. Now I got this line here going to mercantilism because mercantilism was actually an integral part of classic empire building. Right? They use control of trade. Right? All right. So once again, you make your weapons, build your military forces, land and sea, and use that to capture trading ports on key transportation hubs. I mean, think of like the Eastern Mediterranean in the Levant, that controlled the Silk Road trade, or any of the key nodes in the spice trade in the Indian Ocean, for example. All right, so you capture a trading port on a key transportation hub, all right, and then establish trade relations. You establish trade partnerships, secure trade routes from competitors and pirates. Right, this involved a lot of competition, naval warfare, land warfare to control the land portions of those trading hubs. And then you conduct arbitrage. Arbitrage is simply, you have two different markets where in one market you have a commodity where it's produced and it's cheap there, like tea in China. Then you have another market where the commodity is of high demand and is not produced there. So you have low supply, high demand, and that affects price. Tea in China is cheap. You ship it to England where there's high demand and is not made, then you get a lot better price and you make profit, all right? So you have vast profits. You capture profits. You create wealth, right? With that, you build your military forces. All right. Mercantilism. Uh, it was in the classic age. It was probably the greatest means of concentrating wealth. Uh, you're controlling the stream of wealth in these trade routes. All right. Okay. Now, colonialism was basically an extension of mercantilism. Right, so again, you make your weapons, build your military forces, both land and sea. Use it to capture trading ports, but you don't limit to a seaborne trading port, right? You go inland, you conquer inland territory, and then you control resource production within the country. Instead of having to rely, like in mercantilism, instead of having to rely upon, some other producer and some other transporter of goods, and then umpteen different middlemen, in which profit is cut in each I mean, they're taking a cut of the profits along the way, right? So your share is cut out. So instead of limiting yourself to that, well, you control resource production directly, you control transportation within the country. So it's a form of upstream integration. You better control the supply, you better control the price, therefore, and then increase profits, and you can better ensure a reliable source of raw materials to feed your home industries. All right. So colonialism developed especially in the time of the early industrial revolution. It expanded greatly then. Uh, so you build interior transportation, trains, which were developed more and more about 1830s, steam engine trains, and then river transportation, which expanded with steam engine again about the same time, 1830s beginning. And then you control currency within a country. Now, I have these three to go together: currency, tax, labor. I can also add in there banking. But so the reason why these go together is because uh, if you control the currency, first of all, obviously, you're going to make big money in creating money, right? You make money in creating money, right? You're expanding the demand for money, you're expanding the supply of money, and you're making that money. But now, why taxes are important is taxes are a fundamental means of establishing value for that currency within a territory, right? They got to pay taxes with this currency. The taxes you have to pay, or you go to jail, is only satisfied by paying the demanded currency, right? Now, taxes and labor go together because oftentimes in these colonial, third world countries, they didn't have, a currency based or traditional labor system. They may have had hunter gathering, so forth, right? So labor was something that they're like, why should I do this, right? And that would diminish the labor supply. So the forced labor, well, one of the ways is apart from slavery, one of the ways was to establish taxation. Then, if they're taxed and they have to pay these taxes, or they go to jail, right? Then they got to get a job to get currency, right, with which they can pay that tax. All right. So oftentimes you would develop within the country. Instead of just extracting raw material, you would utilize that country for a cheap labor source. So you develop manufacturing within that country. You also secure import markets. All right. Oftentimes they would get tax-free import, duty-free, uh, and this way you have a source of demand to dump your excess manufactured goods, all right? And then you control distribution markets and made easy with controlled transportation, both trains and rivers. You know, the advantage of rivers were used for transportation for time and more, forever, and they already had developed distribution networks, along those rivers. You control the river transportation. You have now monopoly power within those distribution markets. Secure trade routes, right, to and from the country. Requires naval forces. Control urban infrastructure development, especially utilities. This became huge. This became a huge source of exported capital. Late 19th century, you developed trains. We talked about it already, but you also developed streetcars, electricity, water, sewage. All right, each of these become, they become constant money makers. Right? It's like cha-ching, cha-ching every day. Once you get your infrastructure invested and developed, right? They're a steady source of revenues. So you increase wealth extraction out of the territory. Again, you capture profits, use that to build your weapons to enforce this. All right. All right, so that's another step in the evolution of warfare. Oh, by the way, this naturally led to wars of colonial independence. You colonize a territory. Well, after a while, they're going to get sick of it, right? We did, right? You know, England colonized us, and the reason why they colonized us was not for our benefit, but for theirs, right? So they're using us within a system which was skewed to benefit England, to a greater extent. All right. So we sought a war of colonial independence, and unfortunately, a lot of the third world conflict during the Cold War, which was defined as ideological conflicts, right? At their heart, they were wars of colonial independence, which got mixed up, unfortunately, with ideology. All right. So last stage here, modern industrial. This is more complex. This is more sophisticated ways of making money off of weapons and military forces. Now, industrial. Industrial means machine manufacturing. Began roughly around 1800s, a little before you could say, right? Key thing was the development of the cotton gin, which really, unleashed the Industrial Revolution, which began in textiles. All right, but the key with machine manufacturing, you have vast increases in production volume. All right. So with this, weapons production itself became a primary source of profit and economic stimulus. Right. So just making the weapons. Now, here previously, you make the weapons to control resources. I mean, you're still making money off the weapons back here, right? I mean, the weapons industry has always been profitable, whether you're making swords or bow and arrows or spears or shields, whatever. But with the modern industrial age, you're making vast more profits, especially as technology increased. As technology increased and the weapons became far more sophisticated and far beyond, what uh, a common market. Well, let's see, what's the best way of putting it? Well, let's take a nuclear weapon. You can't go to Walmart and buy a nuclear weapon, right? So it's going to minimize, it's going to decrease the amount of competition for production of that, right? And with decreased competition, you can better maximize profits. All right, so that's one thing about military weapons. With increased sophistication, you have increased prices, increased profit margins. Um, all right, so weapons production itself becomes a primary source of profit and economic stimulus. You talk about the in the Keynesian sense. Whatever aspect of Keynesianism you want to talk about, underutilization of production capacity, use of fiscal policy, demand side stimulus, increase the velocity of money. The equation for GDP is real simple. It's simply the volume of money, the money supply times the velocity of money, right? And one thing of note is the federal budget is always over 50% military. What the government spends, our federal government spends, is most of it goes to military. And it's not just that. You got the multiplier effect, which can be 3 to 4 times, right? All right, so conflict or war can be created to create debt. This is very common today. Common use of conflict. Now, that debt is used to leverage and control the production of commodities, whether it's like oil or diamonds or something like that, right? And then if you control that production indirectly, you gain control over supply and thus price. All right. Now, I can't explain this until I get to my lesson on U.S. policy in the Middle East, and yeah, right. You'll see it better then. Conflict war can be created to control the flow of collective resources, tax revenues, right? Budgets, steering the stream of flow towards yourself. Now, again, in the same lesson, I'll teach you how, man, you can control LOGCAP, Logistics Civilian Augmentation Program, or these private military security contractor corporations, or you control reconstruction contracts, which are required after you destroy all sorts of stuff during war, right? It's another means of making money. Um, Conflict war can be used as a means of flipping client states into your sphere of influence, which can then create a larger threat. Let's say a larger Cold War between superpower countries. Again, these will have to be explained then. I know a lot of these are probably kind of vague to your understanding right now. You're not seeing a real example of how this is done. I'll give you real examples, but I can't give you that to you now in this short introduction. Conflict war can be used as a means of enforcing currency discipline, right? Thus ensuring currency value with increasing money supply. It's many people suspect, which is probably to a certain degree very credible, that the key reason for our invasion of Iraq was the fact that in 2000, I think it was October 2000, Saddam Hussein abandoned the petrodollar, right, and shifted to the euro as the currency used to pay for oil, which is going to accept in exchange for oil. And a few years after that was like 2011, I guess, when Gaddafi was taken out. Key thing that he was doing was he wanted to get off the French franc. The French franc is a currency that dominated West Africa, and he wanted to establish within the entire region a currency, a gold-backed currency, the dinar, which is a Middle Eastern currency, and replace the French franc with that. and get off the petrodollar. All right, and now you get off the petrodollar. It's not just Iraq. It's not just Libya. Right? It's a threat that all nations may shift to alternative currencies. You know, whether it's the euro or whether it's the yuan or whether it's the dinar. Right? That's a threat to the American dollar. Um, Okay, conflict war can be used to benefit the balance of trade. Conflict war can be used to influence elections, control politics, and I give a couple examples here. One example is LBJ. And I'll teach you the Gulf of Tonkin incident and how this was totally manufactured. There's plans left behind, the 30-day plan left behind, and how they're going to do this, right? And how they said, for example, Rusk, I think his first name was Dean Rusk. Anyway, Rusk was the Secretary of State, and in one of the meetings he said, "Listen, if we create an incident, what they called a dramatic event, right? There's going to be a natural route. There's going to be anxiety among the population, and there's going to be a rallying around the president, and his support's going to go up." And sure enough, after that incident, Johnson, who was suffering low approval rating, performance, whatever, approval of presidential performance rating, in the low 30%. He doubled it to mid 60s, like 65% overnight. And then he walked into that was in August. So then a couple months later, he walked into the November election and won by a landslide. Now, Karl Rove said the same thing about the Iraq War resolution, right? And he said, "Yeah, push this resolution, push the fear about this, right? The urgency about this, and this will give a big boost to the Republican Party, right?" And sure enough, Republican Party uh, stole away both the House and the Senate from the Democrats in that election. All right, this is the first. This is the first lesson I'm going to teach you how the Bush administration manipulated the U.S. population into the Iraq invasion war. All right, so all this stuff here is not like actual specific historical examples, right? This is just like general statements on the evolution. I will give you those general statements, right? So now but that's one lesson at a time. So, chief takeaway knowledge here is, well, military power is always dependent upon control of resources, both human and material, and the accumulation or concentration of wealth. All right. With the Industrial Revolution, the means of acquiring wealth through war has become more diverse and sophisticated, and the war itself, apart from controlling resources, it's an economic stimulus in and of itself in modern industrial warfare. Again, it is for a country in which production capacity is not destroyed. For example, off the top of my head, I'm just kind of winging this. Off the top of my head, the U.S. did great during World War II because our borders weren't touched, right? Bombers didn't fly over the Atlantic Ocean and bomb our cities and our industries. Our production capacity was untouched. It just got a huge boost from the war. It just built up. So we're rolling in cash after the war. Other nations, look at like a nation like Germany. Germany's production capacity was destroyed, and they suffered. Japan the same, and they suffered poverty for a good amount of time, at least a decade, right? But in the long term, even that destruction serves as a source of demand, because it stimulates reconstruction. But that's more long term. If you destroy production capacity in the short term, you know, it just throws you into desperate poverty. All right, myths about U.S. wars and that the American public believes. I mean, this is widespread, and it's usually based on the fact that Americans generally don't know much about U.S. history. All right, so it's generally believed, especially given the fact that people want to make themselves feel good about themselves. It's believed that the U.S. did not fight many wars, so we're a peace-loving nation, right? The U.S. did not start wars, but only fight wars after we've been attacked. All right, we fight defensive wars. Another myth is democracies are inherently peace loving. All right, and just off the top of my head, if you really think about it, and I'll show you these wars, right, for the U.S. anyways, but two of the most militaristic countries in recent history, in the last several hundred years, especially Great Britain, right, has been democracies. Uh, look at the United Kingdom, right? How did they get world empire? Well, they're waging war everywhere throughout the world, conquering peoples, right, controlling those populations, and um, anyways. So we did much the same in our expansion, our imperial expansion in our country and then overseas. You'll see that in reality we fight a lot of wars here. Uh, So here's some brief facts to get like a starter. And again, this is not giving you the details of how we start wars. It's just an appetizer, so to speak, just to you know uh, dispel some commonly held myths, right? So between the years of 1775 and 2019, when I did the study, um, there have been 244 years of our existence as a nation. Now, a lot of people may debate this, say, well, oh, no, we weren't a nation until the Constitution was ratified. When was it ratified? Like 1787 or something like that, right? I mean, yeah, or we weren't a nation until we declared officially our Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm citing 1775. I'm expanding the year here, right? The number of years, one by 1 year. So, simply because in reality, what was our real Declaration of Independence? An official document, or when we started the war, saying, "Well, screw you, England. We're free." That's our independence right there. That's when we start. Um, in that time, between this time, 244 years, the U.S. has fought 675 war years. Now I'll show you the list, right? War after war, each year when wars were fought. Uh, Now, if you take that and divide that by 244, that means we're fighting 2.77 wars every single year of our existence. All right? Every year that we, as a nation, we fight 2.77 wars on average. Right? Now, out of 244 years, there were only 16 years in which we weren't at war. Only 16 years of peace. So this idea that we don't fight wars, and we're always fighting wars, right? And most of these wars are not defensive wars. Most of these wars were for expanding our territory. That's just the way it was. We landed at, Jamestown, right? And from there on, we took the rest of the country, right? Um, okay. Now, this list does not include the many, many U.S. military inventions. This includes more just formal wars. All right. You know, these military inventions are short-term military interventions. Oftentimes in Latin America or in the Caribbean or so forth. All right. The question is, were all these wars justified? Right? Were they really defensive wars, or were they offensive and expansionist? All right. Now, I know people are going to debate. They're going to say, well, the Indians started these wars, right? They attacked us first. Well, whether or not they attacked Americans first, those Americans who were moving on and occupying their land, right? We were expanding. They weren't expanding. All right, justified war. So, I'm going to say Revolutionary War was justified, right? No doubt about it. Why should we be slaves to Great Britain, right? Why should they exploit us and use us within a system that profits them, which holds us back, right? Anti-piracy wars, yeah. Well, you don't want piracy. You want to protect commerce. That's huge. Commerce has to be protected. Uh, freedom of navigation. World War II was justified because, well, you're fighting Nazi Germany. I mean, you know, apart from being evil, I mean, just Germany in control of the lion's share, for example, of the world's oil, if they acquired the Middle East, right? And resources, for example, if they acquired resources within Russia, the breadbasket in the south, or the Ural Mountains, right? For minerals, that'd have been a problem. Um, Probably North Korea, probably Korean War, but you know what? I don't know enough about the Korean War to say for sure. Right? Any wars to suppress rebellion, war on terror, at least in part. I mean, invasion of Iraq was. We'll talk about that in the first lesson, but I mean, they attacked us, right? All right. Almost all the rest of the wars involved expansion, either territory, economic in some other way, right, and thus wanting, right. So first thing I'll do is I'll examine the wars during the years 1775 to 2019. All right, and then I'll examine years, since we arrived at Jamestown up into 1775. Right. So here's my chart. I'll show you the way it's laid out here. Here's the year. We go through 1 year at a time. Right, and these are the wars that are fought. For example, there's 1 year fought here, the Beaver Wars. All right, and total number of wars fought during that year. I didn't add them up here for the colonial times. This would be one. All right, so let's jump ahead to 1775. Of course, 1775, we were fighting in the Revolutionary War. There's 1775, Revolutionary War, right? Now, if I have red here, just this is not meant to be racial, but this shows wars against American Indians, right? Black is wars against someone else, usually European. Uh, could be Mexican or somewhere in the Pacific. So 1775, we're fighting the Revolutionary War. Then we're fighting the Cherokee American Wars, right? Okay, so 2 wars for fighting. All right, again, 2 wars. All right, these wars lasted a good amount of time. All right. Uh, so every year you see that there's no break from wars. Here we're fighting Shays rebellions. Okay, these rebellions, you got to put down these rebellions too. Uh, Here are 2 years which we didn't fight wars. Rare 2 years, only 2 of 16. Okay, quasi war, Barbary wars. These are pirate wars. These are justified. We're not fighting wars here, so a relatively peaceful time here. All right, so this is 1787, our Constitution. All right, and then for a period here, we're at relative peace, right? Then uh, you got War of 1812. We'll talk about this. I'll give you a lesson on the War of 1812, which is far different from what you typically get. You know, it integrates far more information about what's going on in the world as opposed to usually the typical isolated to impressment and obstruction of trade. Um, all right, so more wars, a lot of wars against Indians. Uh, we're taking territory, we're expanding our country. Uh, uh, Sumatra, okay, so this is overseas now. Mexican American War, this is how we acquired the Southwest US. All right, more wars against Indians, we're expanding into territory. All right. Uh, there's a lot of Indian wars here, and this is after the Civil War, or at least after things. The legislation in the Northern Controlled Congress, which opened up Western expansion. Most of that legislation beginning around, well, the first legislation was the moral tariff, but then followed by a series in 1862, 1863. Really opened up Western expansion. All right, so a bunch of wars against Indians. All right, more rebellion. We took the Philippines. This is about commerce and trade with Asia. All right, all right. This is a lot of banana war stuff here. Here's a big chunk of peace. How about that? Great Depression time and World War II. This is the war that pulled us out of the Great Depression. Um, then you have the Cold War, right? A lot of anti-communist stuff here. Okay, modern day. Then you get into the Iraq no-fly zone stuff. We'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about weapons of mass destruction, weapons inspections. I'll discuss Scott Ritter's book, in which he, from firsthand account, as a chief on the scenes weapons inspector for the United Nations on the ground, he's talking about what the U.S. was doing with these weapons inspections, and it's not too pretty. Um, okay, so now, the vast majority of U.S. wars were offensive wars to take territory from Indians, Spanish, Mexicans, British, French, whoever, right? That's how we got our country, right? Other offensive wars were conducted to take strategic islands, to force access to overseas markets, right? A number of banana wars are fought to protect multinational corporation investments in Latin America and the Caribbean, for example. Right? The key question is, do we start wars? And if so, how? Now, another thing I want to do is, here's a key question. Do we start these wars? Right? Is America really the peace-loving nation? Well, we're dispelling the myths here. This myth is not true, that we don't fight many wars. We're fighting wars all the time, right? Now, does the U.S. start wars, or do we only fight defensive wars? We have started many offensive wars, right? And many of the wars that people think were defensive, well, we really started. And I'll teach you how that is done. I'll teach you today. I'll probably get to today how we did the Iraq invasion war, how the Bush administration manipulated the public into the Iraq invasion war, right? Are democracies inherently peace loving? That is a myth, right? Both U.S. and Britain were constantly fighting wars, right? Now you can go back to ancient Greece. I mean, it's often been said that if you compare Athens to Greece, Athens to Sparta, right? Well, Sparta was often known as the militaristic, warrior-like culture and society, and it was, right? It was centered around warfare. Athens, on the other hand, was the first democracy, and it was more based on commercial interests, right? Who had power there? Well, the commercial interests. Well, which of those two countries actually fought the most war? Those city-states. Which of those actually fought the most wars? It was Athens. Athens was fighting more wars, right, to support its commercial interests. The example goes way back to ancient Greece, right? You think democracies are peace loving? I don't think so. Why do people think this? All right. So this is just a broad sketch to dispel some basic fallacies, and I want to give you an idea of how warfare has developed here. Now, I know you're not going to fully appreciate and understand this until I get through all the specific examples. Then you say, oh, I see how it works. That makes sense, right? Things are changing. There's multiple ways of making profit off of war. All right. So I guess I want to show you real quick a list. I'll do this. So this is my planned sequence of wars I'll cover. What's going on here? All right, so I did an introduction. Then I'll do the Iraq invasion war, and then we'll do Vietnam. I'll go back to Scott Ritter's book then, how the U.S. obstructed and sabotaged his efforts to find WMD. We're not trying to find WMD. We're trying to use the fear that that Iraq has WMD. So we'll talk about what he says from direct first-hand experience. Now, Scott Ritter was not some crazy radical, right? He was a Marine Corps major during the first Gulf War. He was on General Schwarzkopf's intelligence staff. He was the lead inspector on the ground for WMD for the United Nations between 1991 and 98. He's a right-wing conservative Republican, super patriotic guy, but you know what's different about most people? He's honest about the crap and dirty games the U.S. played with WMD weapons inspections. Right? He's not blindly beat my chest, make myself feel good, patriotic, which a lot of people are. Right? They don't care about what's true, what's just, what's right before God. They care about me feel good. I'll teach Pearl Harbor. I know people will want to attack that because they think they know about Pearl Harbor. Well, you know, most people don't know much of anything, and the stuff that's out there, you know, well, uh, so I'll go back to the War of 1812 and then Mexican American. These follow chronologically. So I do this because it gives you a better idea of how, expansion into their country was a motivation, and how that progressed, right? What factors became involved? The impact of railroads here. All right, I'll teach Spanish American War, World War One. I'll teach the history of U.S. foreign policy and actions in the Middle East. This is where we'll get into a better understanding of modern day benefit from war. I'll then teach a new Cold War that the U.S. is currently cooking up. Um, then I'll teach an overview of U.S. military interventions. It's not going to get into details. It just gives you overall, more like a statistical analysis of U.S. military interventions. I'll teach a summary of U.S. imperialism, and I'll teach the Guatemala coup and Iran coup. Uh, okay, that's it for this lesson. Let's see here.